When a man begins to cheat, he finds himself in a dark and deceptive place. It's not merely the act of infidelity that defines him in this moment, but the subtle, quiet erosion of everything that was once solid. He tells himself that it's not that bad. He justifies the behavior in his mind, telling himself that his needs are unfulfilled, or perhaps that the person he's betrayed just doesn't understand him. It's easy to begin with the narrative of, I deserve this, or it's not that serious, and that's the lie. The lie he tells himself over and over until he starts to believe it. This manipulation of reality doesn't stop with himself. It extends to everyone around him. He changes the facts to suit his desires, bending truth and hiding contradictions. To hold on to this narrative, he becomes a master of deception, not just to others, but to himself. He's lost in the fog of rationalization, unable to face the raw truth of his actions. And when the truth does slip through, even in the smallest moments, he brushes it aside as something trivial. It's a momentary lapse, a moment of weakness. He refuses to accept the gravity of what he's doing. And here, in this place, integrity begins to crumble. Who he once was and who he's becoming are two different people, and somewhere inside he knows it. The man who once held himself to a standard, who made promises and vows, is now distant and unrecognizable. His actions betray the man he once thought he was. He becomes someone who hides, who lies, and who deceives. In doing so, he begins to erode the very core of who he is, bit by bit. To cope with the madness of his situation, he compartmentalizes. He lives in two separate worlds. One where he is the committed partner, the person he presents to the world and to his partner, and another where he engages in his infidelity. He puts up walls between these two lives, thinking he can balance them, keep them separate. But the truth is, he can't. The boundaries between these two worlds are fragile. In one world, he's the man he's supposed to be, and in the other, he's someone else entirely. Someone he may not even recognize in the end. The feelings of shame and guilt, those emotions he tries so desperately to avoid, are always there. They creep in when he's alone, when he's silent, when he can no longer lie to himself. They are relentless, ever present. But instead of facing them, he avoids them. He pushes them down. And when that becomes too painful, he turns away. He becomes distant. He becomes defensive. His once confident stance begins to falter, and fear takes root in its place. Doesn't he care about the people who trust him? Doesn't he care about the needs of the people around him? And as the lies piled up, something more insidious takes hold. A lack of respect for the person he once cherished. It's not just love that fades, it's respect. What once was a sacred bond now feels expendable. His partner becomes a mere backdrop in the drama of his own selfish desires. The truth is, if he truly respected them, if he truly honored them, he could never betray them in such a way. The foundation cracks, and the relationship becomes something to manipulate, something to escape from. But even in this, there is a deep lurking fear. The man knows, he knows that eventually the truth will be revealed, and with it comes the inevitable consequences. It might be the loss of trust, the destruction of the relationship, or the unraveling of everything he once held dear. The fear of facing this reality is what drives his defensiveness, his evasion. He becomes more closed off, more distant, because deep down he knows that he cannot escape the truth forever. So, what happens when a man cheats? He loses pieces of himself, one betrayal at a time. The man he becomes is not the man he once aspired to be. He's a man in denial, lost in manipulation, hiding behind walls of lies. And in the end, he must face the inevitable consequence, the loss of integrity, respect, and ultimately the destruction of everything he holds dear. Now, the question is not what he does when he cheats, but what he becomes. And in the end, the price of that transformation is far higher than he ever anticipated. When a man is caught in the act of cheating, one of his first and most powerful instincts is to deny the reality of his actions. Denial becomes a shield, an immediate defense mechanism. It's not that he doesn't know what he's doing, it's that he can't face the consequences of it yet. To confront the truth would force him to acknowledge the damage, the betrayal, and the irreversible harm he has done, not just to his partner, but to himself. So in order to gain control, one needs to stop a portion of the victim's tongue. So instead, he bends the tooth. He convinces himself that what he's doing is not as bad as it seems, that it's somehow justified in his mind. The act of cheating is no longer seen as a breach of trust. It's a temporary lapse, a moment of weakness that doesn't define him. He tells himself that circumstances led him to this point, that his needs were ignored, that he was forced into a situation where cheating seemed like the only way to cope. This internal justification is powerful because it lets him maintain his image of himself as a good person. The internal narrative becomes one of righteousness, an attempt to hold on to some form of moral high ground. He convinces himself that the wrong he is committing is not truly his fault, that the situation around him has somehow twisted him into this position. It's never about the lack of commitment or the act of betrayal. It's about external factors, things beyond his control that pushed him to make the choice. He might even feel that in some way he is entitled to this. His justification feeds into his desire to protect his own self-position, to avoid the vulnerability that would come with admitting the truth. The rationalization process becomes an elaborate system of explanations. He convinces himself that his actions don't reflect his true feelings for his partner, that the love is still there, even if the behavior doesn't show it. This creates a disconnect between his actions and his perceived identity. He holds on to the idea that he is a loving, committed person, even though his actions betray that very notion. In other words, when he falters with his self, he may even try to convince others of this, seeking approval from those around him to validate his decisions. He needs to justify to others, but more importantly to himself, that what he's doing is not as bad as it looks. It's a psychological loop that allows him to continue down the path of betrayal with the illusion of control and righteousness intact. It is an attempt to protect his sense of self and prevent the collapse of his identity as a man who holds integrity and honor. And so he justifies the cheating, repeatedly finding new reasons, new excuses to explain away the undeniable reality. This process, however, doesn't stop the damage from accumulating. The longer he justifies, the more entangled he becomes in the web of his own lies. But for a time, this denial and justification provide the comfort of avoidance, the brief illusion of control. As the lies continue to build, the man begins to manipulate not only the perception of others, but also the perception he has of his own actions. He starts to distance himself from the reality of his betrayal, crafting a narrative where his choices seem less harmful, less significant. He reshapes the situation to fit a version of the truth that he can live with. The act of cheating becomes something external, something that happened to him, rather than a conscious choice he made. He convinces himself that he's not truly responsible, that it was a result of an unmet need or an emotional vacuum that drove him to seek comfort elsewhere. This manipulation of reality becomes so ingrained that he begins to believe it, with each passing day reinforcing the distortion. He might tell himself that his partner won't find out, or if they do, they will understand the complexities of the situation. It's a way to diminish the gravity of his actions, to convince himself that there's still a way out without facing the full consequences. There's an inherent dishonesty here that runs deeper than just the affair itself. It's the dishonesty with which he views his own behavior. He can no longer see his actions for what they are, for what they truly represent, and so he pushes the truth away. He might even create new justifications as time goes on, reasons that make the affair seem acceptable, as though it's justifiable by the circumstances or by the emotional state he's in. It is as if the deceit becomes necessary to maintain his sanity in a world where he knows, deep down, he is violating the very foundation of trust. The manipulation goes further when he convinces himself that his partner may already know or suspect, and so he tries to diminish the perceived harm by telling himself that the relationship was already broken. In this way, the man can shift blame away from himself and onto the very person he's hurting. This shift in blame creates a sense of righteousness, further distancing him from responsibility and mitigating his guilt. He convinces himself that his actions are justified because his partner is partly at fault, or that the relationship is simply beyond repair anyway. It is an easy escape from accountability, a false way of preserving his image." End quote. In these moments, the man is not just betraying his partner, but also betraying his own understanding of right and wrong. By twisting his perception of the truth, he dehumanizes the impact of his actions, turning what should be a moment of reflection into another opportunity to avoid the consequences of his choices. Through manipulation, both of the world around him and the internal narrative he builds, he creates a safe space to continue the affair without truly confronting the wreckage he is causing. He doesn't see it in full. He doesn't feel the weight of it in its entirety. The more he manipulates, the further he drifts from the man he once aspired to be. As the man continues down the path of infidelity, the consequences of his actions begin to erode his integrity, piece by piece. Integrity, once a cornerstone of his character, is gradually undermined as the lies grow more tangled and the contradictions between his words and actions become impossible to ignore. What was once a solid foundation, built on promises, trust, and a sense of honor, begins to crumble beneath the weight of his deceit. He can no longer stand firm in the truth of who he once believed he was, because he has violated the very principles that once defined him. The act of cheating is not just an isolated wrong. It is the beginning of a broader moral erosion. With each lie told, each secret kept, his sense of self becomes more fractured. The man who once believed in honesty now lives in a world of duplicity. He begins to make excuses, justifications, and rationalizations to maintain the illusion that he is still the person he once was. But deep down, he knows that he isn't. The core of who he thought he was, the man who could be trusted, the man who held true to his word, begins to fade away as the lies pile up. At first, the damage is subtle. He might feel a slight discomfort, a small pang of guilt, but he can justify it with the excuse that he's not really doing anything too serious. But as time goes on, the reality becomes harder to ignore. He's not just breaking promises, he's breaking the very fabric of his own integrity. The small compromises add up. He tells himself that one lie is not a big deal, that the truth can wait, that it won't hurt anyone if he just keeps pretending. But in doing so, he sacrifices his authenticity, the part of him that once prided itself on being honest and straightforward. This slow erosion becomes a snowball effect. The more he cheats, the more distant he becomes from his true self. His internal conflict intensifies as he struggles to reconcile the person he wants to be with the person he is becoming. He finds himself engaging in mental gymnastics to excuse his behavior, but the tension never truly fades. Over time, this disconnect takes its toll. The man who once held himself to a higher standard now finds himself trapped in a cycle of deceit. His actions no longer align with his values, and with each step further into infidelity, he loses sight of who he really is. His integrity, once a bright light guiding his actions, is now clouded by the darkness of deceit. The man he was, the man who lived with honor and conviction, is slowly replaced by someone who is willing to compromise his morals, his promises, and ultimately his soul for the sake of fleeting satisfaction. He may try to tell himself that it's just a phase, that he's not really a bad person. But the truth remains, the more he compromises his integrity, the less of himself he becomes. And deep inside, he knows this transformation is irreversible. To cope with the ever-growing tension between his outward life and the secret world he's created, a man who cheats often begins to compartmentalize his existence. It's a way to manage the overwhelming guilt and emotional conflict without having to confront the full scope of his actions. He creates separate worlds, one in which he is the devoted partner, the man who promises loyalty and love, and another in which he engages in deceit and betrayal. These worlds exist in isolation from one another, carefully segmented, so he can move between them without the two colliding. In one world, he is the man who holds his partner close, who shares intimate moments, who makes future plans, and who lives as though he has nothing to hide. He appears to be the same man his partner believes him to be, trustworthy, loving, reliable. But in the other world, a different version of him emerges. Here, he is someone who hides his actions, who engages in affairs, and who protects the lies that have become essential to maintaining his double life. He refuses, these two versions of himself are kept completely separate, creating a fragile illusion of balance. This compartmentalization is necessary because without it, the weight of the deception would be unbearable. The man knows that if the two worlds were to collide, the truth would become undeniable and the consequences would be catastrophic. So he works tirelessly to keep them apart, making sure that his interactions in one world don't bleed into the other. He may even develop different personas to navigate these worlds, adopting one set of behaviors and attitudes when he's with his partner and another when he's in the midst of infidelity. Each world has its own rules, its own boundaries, and its own expectations, and the man becomes a chameleon, shifting his identity to fit the needs of the moment. The emotional toll of living this double life begins to wear on him. The man might feel a constant sense of unease, an underlying tension that grows with each passing day. He has to be vigilant, always aware of what he says and does, carefully monitoring his behavior so that neither world overlaps. The effort required to maintain this separation is exhausting, but it's a survival mechanism. If the truth were to surface, it would destroy the carefully constructed balance, exposing the lies and forcing him to face the full reality of what he has done. But even as he compartmentalizes, there's an awareness that the separation can't last forever. The walls between these worlds are fragile. The lies become harder to maintain, the guilt more difficult to suppress. Eventually, the cracks begin to show. A misplaced word, an awkward silence, or a fleeting expression of emotion might give away something he'd rather keep hidden. The man begins to live in constant fear of discovery, knowing that the longer he maintains this separation, the more likely it is that one of the worlds will come crashing down, shattering the illusion he's worked so hard to build. And before he knows what's happened to him and the things other people have taught him, and yet he continues to compartmentalize because in that moment, it's the only way he can preserve the image of himself as someone who is still a good partner, still a person capable of love and commitment, despite everything he's done. It's a way to avoid the painful confrontation with reality, to keep the truth at bay for just a little longer. But this self-imposed exile from the truth comes with its own cost. Each lie, each compartmentalized world distances him further from who he once was and from the man he could have been. He loses sight of the whole, and in the process, he loses himself. As the man continues to navigate his double life, the emotions of shame and guilt begin to creep in, even though he does everything in his power to push them away. These emotions are a constant, lurking under the surface, never fully gone. They are there in the quiet moments, when he's alone with his thoughts, or when he faces a moment of silence between himself and his partner. There's a heaviness that hangs over him, an awareness that what he's doing is wrong, even if he continues to justify it to himself and others. Shame is the emotion that attacks his very identity. It eats away at his sense of self-worth, reminding him of the gap between who he once aspired to be and the man he has become. Deep inside, he knows that he is betraying his own values, the ones he once held dear. He recognizes that his actions are a betrayal not only of his partner, but of the trust he once had in himself. And this realization doesn't always reach the surface. It often stays buried beneath the layers of denial and rationalization. But it's there, and it causes a quiet torment that never quite leaves. Guilt is a shadow that follows him everywhere. It's the constant reminder that he is violating something sacred, that he is lying to someone he cares about, that his actions are causing harm. In the beginning, guilt is something that can be shrugged off, explained away, or buried under the weight of justifications. But as time goes on, it grows more insistent, it grows louder, and the cracks in his narrative become harder to patch up. It is impossible to entirely escape the knowledge that his deceit will eventually be discovered, that the harm he is causing will be exposed, and that the harm he is causing will be exposed. The emotional toll is immense, and it's not just about the fear of getting caught. It's the fear of what he will see in himself when the truth inevitably comes out. He knows on some level that he has lost something valuable. Every lie told, every moment of deceit, chips away at the person he once thought he was. He may try to bury this fear, to convince himself that everything will remain hidden, that the consequences will never fully materialize. But deep down, he understands that the foundation is crumbling. The guilt is always there, a weight on his chest that he cannot fully shake. It's a constant reminder that the person he is becoming is not the man he once wanted to be. It's because he loses the guilt each time he gets nervous. It's because it's suckling. When confronted, these emotions surface with full force. He becomes defensive, not just to protect his actions, but to protect himself from the overwhelming shame and guilt that threaten to drown him. He might lash out, become hostile, or refuse to acknowledge the pain he's caused. His defenses are not just a reaction to the accusation. They are a desperate attempt to shield himself from the rawness of the truth. He is afraid of facing the reality that his actions have torn apart the trust and love he once shared with his partner, and that in doing so, he has also torn apart his own sense of integrity. The shame and guilt grow with each passing day, like an ever-expanding weight that threatens to crush him. He tries to outrun them, but he can't. They are part of the price he pays for betraying the trust of someone who once relied on him. The more he tries to suppress them, the more insistent they become. So eventually these emotions will either force him to confront the truth or drive him further into a state of denial and self-deception. But either way, they remain as an undeniable presence in his life. As the man continues to deceive and betray, a subtle yet powerful shift begins to occur in how he views his partner. It's not simply a loss of love that takes place over time. It is, more insidiously, a loss of respect. And this respect, once foundational to the relationship, begins to erode as the affair continues. His partner, in his mind, becomes less of an equal and more of an object, someone to be manipulated, avoided, or even ignored to preserve the secrecy of his double life. The shift happens quietly, almost imperceptibly. In the beginning, he might still care for his partner, even while engaging in infidelity. The guilt and shame of his actions still allow him to recognize the value of the relationship. But as time passes, and as the lies become more entrenched, he begins to see his partner less as someone he cherishes and more as someone who exists as a backdrop to his own desires and needs. And indeed, he is no longer seeing them for who they truly are, with their strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Instead, they become a symbol of the life he wants to keep intact while pursuing other desires. His view of them becomes warped. The respect he once had for them is replaced by an almost transactional view of the relationship. They are no longer his partner in the truest sense of the word. They become a role to play, a facade to maintain. His partner is something that needs to be kept in the dark, to be sheltered from the truth, so that he can continue to live in the false security of his double life. Okay? My partner is the person that the act of cheating reveals this growing disrespect, because it is, in essence, an act of disregard for the person he's meant to love and honor. It is not just the physical betrayal, it's the psychological detachment that grows over time. He begins to feel as though he is entitled to his actions, justifying them because he has already created a narrative in which his partner is somehow less deserving of his loyalty. This loss of respect manifests in small, subtle ways. He might become dismissive, ignoring the little things that once mattered. The conversations, the shared experiences, the moments of intimacy. He might stop seeing his partner as an equal, someone worthy of his full attention and admiration. Instead, he may grow indifferent to their needs and concerns, brushing them aside in favor of the selfish pursuits that he is now prioritizing. His partner's emotions may seem less significant, and their value becomes tied to how well they fit into the narrative he's built for himself. In the most extreme cases, this lack of respect can manifest as anger or resentment toward the person he's betraying. The man who is cheating may feel justified in his actions, believing that his partner has somehow failed him or is responsible for his discontent. This creates a cycle of blame, where he shifts the responsibility for his actions onto the very person he's betraying. Instead of facing the uncomfortable truth about his own choices, he blames his partner for everything that led to the affair. This resentment, this growing contempt, allows him to justify further betrayal, as he no longer sees his partner as worthy of the love and trust they once shared. The loss of respect is perhaps one of the most damaging effects of infidelity, because it is not just a temporary shift. It fundamentally alters the dynamics of the relationship. The man no longer sees his partner as someone to be honored and valued, but rather as someone to be managed, controlled, or even discarded when the truth comes to light. The bond that once connected them becomes frayed and weakened, and the foundation of trust that was built over time begins to crumble under the weight of his own disregard. As the man continues to live in deception, he becomes trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and internal conflict that he cannot easily escape. He begins to question his own motivations and the reasons behind his actions. The once clear lines of right and wrong blur, and he is forced to reckon with the moral ambiguity of his choices. He starts to ask himself, why am I doing this? What is it that I am seeking? This internal dialogue becomes more intense as the affair continues, and the man's awareness of the damage he is causing grows. But instead of confronting these questions with honesty, he tries to suppress them. He convinces himself that he is simply fulfilling a need, that his actions are driven by external circumstances beyond his control, whether it's emotional dissatisfaction, unmet desires, or a feeling of neglect. He tells himself that this is a temporary escape, that it doesn't define who he is or the love he has for his partner. Yet, with each lie he tells himself, the truth becomes harder to see. The more he rationalizes his actions, the more distant he becomes from the man he once wanted to be. His self-deception is so deep that even he begins to believe his own justifications, though somewhere in the back of his mind, a faint, nagging voice knows that this is not the whole truth. The affair might start as a way to fill a void, to temporarily satisfy a desire or emotional need that feels unmet. But over time, he starts to realize that no amount of external validation or fleeting satisfaction can replace what he is truly losing: trust, integrity, and the deep connection he once had with his partner. This realization only adds to the internal conflict. He is torn between the person he used to be, the man who valued commitment, loyalty, and truth, and the person he is becoming, who is now willing to compromise those very values for the sake of momentary indulgence. It's this growing self-doubt that makes the man question everything. He starts to wonder if he's a good person at all. He can no longer reconcile the actions he is taking with the man he once thought himself to be. He might try to tell himself that everyone makes mistakes, that he's not the only one who has strayed, or that his partner's imperfections somehow justify his own actions. But these thoughts do little to ease the turmoil inside. The internal conflict only becomes more painful because deep down he knows that he has crossed a line, that he has betrayed more than just his partner. He has betrayed himself. This struggle between self-deception and self-awareness is exhausting. The man knows he is slipping further from the ideals and values that once defined him, yet he doesn't know how to turn back. He is caught between two worlds. The world where he is the man who upholds his values, and the world where he chooses to live in dishonesty. The longer the affair lasts, the deeper the rift becomes. But sometimes the relationship is so deep, he finds himself trapped in a cycle of shame, guilt, and self-doubt that he cannot escape, but he also cannot face. Eventually, this internal conflict forces him to confront the truth. He can no longer maintain the illusion that everything is fine or that his actions are justified. The man must either face the consequences of his betrayal, whether that be through the collapse of the relationship or the internal collapse of his own sense of self, or continue to live in a state of denial, self-deception, and moral decay. But either path leads to a painful realization. The cost of the affair is far higher than the fleeting gratification it once promised. In the end, the path of deceit is one that leads not just to the betrayal of another, but to the betrayal of oneself. A man who chooses to cheat forfeits his integrity, sacrifices the trust of someone who believed in him, and becomes entangled in a web of lies that ultimately ensnares his own soul. Let's begin by establishing what truth is. What is it? Is it a lie? Is it the truth? Is it both? It's not merely about the act of infidelity. It's about the gradual erosion of character, the loss of respect for oneself and others, and the deepening of wounds that may take years, if not a lifetime, to heal. True strength lies not in avoiding discomfort or chasing fleeting satisfaction, but in confronting life's challenges with honesty, courage, and accountability. When a man acts with integrity, he builds relationships founded on trust, love, and mutual respect. Relationships that can weather storms and endure the test of time. But when he chooses the path of betrayal, he dismantles the very foundation on which such relationships are built. Ultimately, the measure of a man is not found in his ability to justify his mistakes, but in his willingness to face them, to learn from them, and to grow into someone who values truth, honor, and love above all else. It is never too late to choose integrity, to rebuild what has been broken, and to become a person who stands firm in the values that truly matter.